Welcome, folks, back to EarthSky. I am David Adalian, and today we have got one of the greatest stories of humanity ever told. No, I am not overselling this one. Our guest today has gathered compelling scientific evidence of how primordial gatherings by our ancient primate ancestors millions of years ago, feasts of fermented, slightly alcoholic fruit may have led many, many generations later to the invention of agriculture and to the rise of human civilization. It's a long and complicated story, so grab an adult beverage. Mine is coffee, and let's enjoy the tale, huh? Cheers. Here we go. Our guest today is Nathaniel Dominy. Nate, he is a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist at Dartmouth College in Vermont, and he is the lead author of a paper that draws a convincing connection between the fruit gathering of primates millions of years ago to our own love of cocktail parties and happy hour. Nate, welcome to the show. We are glad to have you.
Thanks, Dave. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, this is a great and very interesting story. Let's start with the title of your group's paper. You were the lead author on this guy. Fermented fruits, scrumping, sharing, and the origin of feasting, one of my favorite things. There's an unfamiliar word there for a lot of people, though. It's a bit of jargon, scrumping. What is scrumping, and why do we think our ancestors did it? We're talking like 14,000 plus years, a million years ago, correct?
That's right. So scrumping is it's a British word that's familiar to many people in the UK, and it's often viewed as a cheeky word. So it's a word for children, potentially people sneaking into orchards and gathering or stealing the fruits that have fallen to the ground. It's not used often today, but the echoes of this word are pretty familiar to anyone who goes into a British pub, because you can order scrumpy, especially during the cider season. And it's usually a homemade cloudy cider, and the alcohol content's pretty high, between 6 and 9%. In the United States, we don't use the word very often, but we will describe something as scrumptious, which is a legacy of that history. So something that's scrumptious is delectable, it's enticing, it's delicious, it's alluring. So it's got all of these elements of temptation and attraction, which may explain why in the Gothic art tradition, we see scrumping all the time. Many depictions of the Garden of Eden show primates on the ground gathering apples. So scrumping is just a familiar term, and there's a rich repertoire of artistic imagery, iconographic imagery showing this very behavior and its relationship to non-human primates. So to answer your question, we didn't invent the word scrumping. We were struggling with a way to distill a concept. The concept being that great apes, particularly African great apes, they find themselves on the forest floor a lot. A gorilla is a big animal, can weigh north of 400 pounds. And so the problem with being that big and living in the trees is that it's hazardous, and there's always a risk of falling and hurting yourself, or worse, dying. And so the curious thing about great apes is that they're built to climb, they're built to be in the trees, but oddly enough, they spend most of their time on the ground. So we think that their large body size imposes some costs, and it imposes some risk, and they mitigate those risks by moving on the ground a lot. And so in 2015, these researchers identified, these geneticists identified a special mutation in the gene that encodes the enzyme that is expressed in our esophagus and stomach that allows us to metabolize alcohol. And what they found, to their surprise, is that in gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans, there's a single mutation, just a single change, that dramatically changes the efficiency of the enzyme. So ADH4 is 40 times more effective in humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas than it is in other primates. So the fact that it was retained in the lineage that gave rise to chimpanzees and bonobos, the lineage that gave rise to gorillas, and the lineage that gave rise to us, suggests that it provided an advantage. And that advantage would have existed 10 million years ago at least. Now, if I had told you and your listeners that we are specially processed, or we're specially adapted for processing alcohol, you and your listeners wouldn't be surprised, because we've been drinking alcohol for a long time. And your listeners would say, well, there's an archaeological record. We know that people have been producing beer since the Neolithic. We know that people have been producing wine. There's depictions in Egyptian tombs of people producing wine. So your average listener might say, big whoop, big deal. We already know that we've been drinking alcohol for a long time. So the surprise of this study was that the adaptation for processing alcohol was not 10,000 years ago, coincident with the origins of agriculture. It was much older. It was 10 million years ago. And the implications are pretty profound. It means that we humans were pre-adapted to metabolize alcohol long before we ever figured out the know-how for making it on purpose. We were prepared to drink alcohol long before we ever figured out directed fermentation, which is strongly associated with the agricultural revolution, when we started to domesticate plants and animals and start farming and living in sedentary societies. So these authors, they had a terrific study. It was a terrific outcome. And they were stuck for an explanation. And they hypothesized that, well, the best explanation comes from the fact that African apes spend so much time on the forest floor, right, as I talked about. And that maybe as they're moving across the forest floor, they would have seen fruits that had fallen to the ground. And because it's so costly to climb, and so energetically taxing and so risky, why not just eat the fruit that's on the ground, right? It's just the logical, convenient thing to do. And that when that mutation happened, it was favored in those animals that were eating the fruits on the ground, and it gave them an advantage because they could process that ethanol efficiently. You just want to process it well enough to get the calories. Alcohol does have calories, right? And that's a valuable thing in a place where calories are scarce. And you mitigate those costs of climbing, as I said. So there's all sorts of reasons why consuming fruits from the ground would be advantageous. And so they make this argument that maybe the ancestors of African apes were consuming fruits from the ground, and that's why they retained this special mutation, and that apes that live in Asia and monkeys don't typically do that. And it's a pretty clever idea. The weakness of it is twofold. First, we don't know if those fruits have ethanol at all, or more ethanol than the fruits on the trees. We don't know that. We still don't really know that. And then the second problem is we don't know how often gorillas and chimpanzees actually pick up a fruit on the forest floor. And the reason why we don't know is because primatologists are following these animals. And when an animal eats a fruit, we take notes in our data book. We'll say what kind of fruit it is. We'll note the species. We might note the other animals that are around the animal eating the fruits, like how many animals are in that party, for example. We collect a lot of data on the consumption of fruit, but we never really bothered to distinguish where the fruit came from. Did it come from the trees or did it come from the ground? And so the irony is this is a terrific idea, and you would think that we've been studying great apes since the 1960s. You'd think there was 50 years of data to draw on to test it, and it's just not true because we just don't carefully note those differences.
Alcohol is a toxin, but our ancestors were able to metabolize it better, and that gave them an advantage in feeding and so in reproduction, I assume. Is that right?
Yes. So one of the problems with this hypothesis is, and this hypothesis, by the way, is sometimes referred to as the drunken monkey hypothesis. And it was advanced by a professor at UC Berkeley in 2000. And he made the point that all fruits are going to have some trace levels of ethanol. It is unavoidable because yeast is always present. And so it's just an unavoidable fact of life that any animal that eats fruit is going to be ingesting some ethanol. This is true if you go to the grocery store and just get bananas off the shelf. There's going to be trace levels of ethanol in the bananas. So any ripe fruit is going to have some amount. So the problem for a chimpanzee is that it eats a lot of fruit. So if we have trace levels, we're talking less than 1% in a single fruit. But a chimpanzee throughout the day eats close to 10 pounds of fruit. So it's just the magnitude becomes an issue. And so it's been calculated, and these are back of the envelope calculations, but it's thought that the average chimpanzee consumes between 1 and 1.5 standard drinks of alcohol every day. So that's not enough to get drunk. So, and that's the problem with the name, right? Calling it the drunken monkey hypothesis implies motor impairment, which is obviously detrimental. So we're not talking about drunkenness. We're just talking about a chronic level of exposure where every day these animals are ingesting just a small amount that's equivalent to 1 drink for a human being. And so the actual effects on them are pretty minimal, but there's enough for selection to operate. So they have to, it's just advantageous if their body can process it well. If it encourages social interactions, those may have benefits. So that just 1 drink a day is probably offering them some benefits. But you're right, any amount is costly, but we think the benefits probably outweigh those costs. They must have, otherwise it wouldn't have been retained in all the African apes, including ourselves.
Okay, so we haven't touched on feasting yet. And when you were talking about scrumping earlier, you used the adjective cheeky to describe it. And I'm reminded of Mike Myers on Saturday Night Live when he played a young British child who would call people cheeky monkeys. Yeah. So that seems to imply that might there be a small amount of relaxation on the animal's part when they're consuming this? Are they feeling maybe a little more adventurous, a cheeky monkey?
Absolutely. It may facilitate additional play behaviors, and we know play has all sorts of adaptive advantages for younger animals. It may allow the relaxation and stress mitigation, which is going to have knock-on benefits too. So there could be many positive outcomes, especially because of the social interactions. And you alluded to the sharing. There was a paper published just a few months ago, maybe 2 months ago now, by a group out of the UK from the University of Exeter. And they had set up camera traps in Guinea-Bissau, a West African country. And they found, to their surprise, that chimpanzees would gather with these massive fruits. And it may be hard for your viewers to imagine a trichulia fruit in Africa is massive. It's maybe 20 pounds. It's like watermelon sized.
Yeah, they don't have to imagine. There you go.
And so so chimpanzees typically don't share like that kind of exchange of food. I mean, they might share high value items like a bit of monkey meat, for example, if they've hunted a colobus monkey, but in general, they don't share their food. And so what was so striking is that when it came to these massive fruits, they were big enough that you could divide them and offer pieces to other individuals. And that is such a conspicuous behavior because it's so rare among chimpanzees. And so then these researchers measured the ethanol content of this fruit, and it was pretty good. I mean, some of them I think were around 3% alcohol, right? So that's equivalent to maybe a light beer in the United States. So they in their paper they alluded to this idea that ethanol seems to be a motivation to share food in a group of animals. And so maybe our human propensity to gather together and share food, often with fermented foods and fermented beverages, feasting is awfully important for community building, for identity formation. I mean, feasting is essential to human behavior. If you think about the word companion, it's from Latin meaning with bread, right? Which is a fermented food. So like companionship, breaking bread, I mean, these are essential, integral elements of human nature. And they're seeing the roots of those behaviors in the chimpanzees who are sharing fermented foods with each other. So we think that's a fascinating idea, and it raises a whole host of questions. Like, do chimpanzees that share fermented foods, do they have better social relationships? Are they, you can establish measures of friendship. Are they friendlier toward each other? So now we can start to explore all kinds of questions about groups that share versus groups that don't, or groups that share more often versus that do that less often. Like, we can ask questions about social cohesion and community formation and frequency of interactions. I mean, this is opening up a whole lot of doors that could help us understand the origins of feasting. So
Yeah, we're getting some quantified data here is what I'm seeing. And
exactly.
yeah, I think what you were saying. So what are we looking at here? Tell us what we're looking at.
So once we had the word, once we decided, okay, we're going to call feeding on fermented fruit, we're going to call feeding on fruits on the ground. And we don't know if they're fermented or not, but just the very act of picking a fruit up from the ground, we're going to call it scrumping. And once we have a word for it, then we can communicate with our colleagues. So we called up our friends who would have data on fruit eating by these primates. And we know it's typical for primatologists to note the height at which an animal is when it's feeding. And so if the fruit that it fed on develops in the crowns of a tree, if it develops in the canopy of a forest, and the height the animal is feeding on it is 0 meters, meaning it's on the ground, then we could call that scrumping. And so we just simply asked our colleagues to cross-reference the type of fruit that they fed on with the height that it was fed on, and to call those behaviors scrumping. And then we calculated the frequency at which these different animals scrumped. And so what you're seeing on the screen now are the data for orangutans. You can see they rarely scrump. These are highly arboreal apes. They rarely come to the ground. They rarely scrump. Only large males will sometimes come to the ground. And when they are on the ground, they're eating like bark and other things like that. They're just not scrumping. And then in the African apes, the mountain gorillas, the western gorillas, and chimpanzees, you can see that scrumping is a much more frequent behavior. In western gorillas, that's like 61% of their time feeding on fruit is not in the trees, it's on the ground. And so this finding strongly corroborates the hypothesis that was advanced in 2015, where they made this argument that feeding on fruits may explain the evolution of that particular mutation. We're showing that yes, indeed, the African apes are regular scrumpers and the Asian apes are not. But
So
I should emphasize, those are just a handful of populations, right? I mean, we don't know if those data are representative of all orangutans or all chimpanzees. So we think all we've done is just said, look, here's a word we can use. Here's an interesting pattern. Maybe it pans out, maybe it doesn't, but we should start looking at these behaviors more carefully.
And there's an important reason for that. I mean, you've opened a really interesting question up here. And in the paper, you said this: the significance of this mutation is rather profound, representing potentially a signal moment in the history of life on Earth. And the place you're going with this is that we may have developed agriculture maybe 12,000 years ago in Turkey, near Göbekli Tepe, and eventually civilization because of this socialization that comes from scrumping fruit. Is that the full circle?
Yeah. If scrumping favored the mutation, the ADH4 mutation, if ADH4 mutation pre-adapted us to metabolize ethanol, and if the origins of agriculture are tied to feasting, if people were motivated to gather wild cereals, now think about it, a wild cereal, like the progenitors of barley, wheat, sorghum, these were small seeds. The amount of effort that it would have taken to go into the wild and gather these small seeds to produce something, either bread or beer, probably the goal was not to eat it yourself, but to give it away. Because that's how you get status. You give away the bread or you give away the beer, which implies a social interaction. And then, so the origins of feasting are strongly tied. The origins of sharing fermented food is strongly tied with the need, the compulsion to then produce more and more of it, which then ultimately leads to the domestication of those crops and the shift from pastoralism and hunting and gathering to a sedentary culture. And then you get social stratification and you get the rise of civilization. And then you get the Anthropocene, you get the industrial age, and you get the changes we're making now to our planet. It could all go back to scrumping. So, there's a lot of dots that are being connected there, but it could, the Neolithic revolution changed everything. It changed our planet, right? We have had such a profound impact on our planet. And what was the reason to domesticate plants and animals? Probably to produce fermented products.
So what's next then? Where do we go from? We have all of these bits of evidence and they sure seem to go straight down a line towards something. How do we thicken that line? Can we?
Yeah, we need to. I mean, there's a gaping hole. We don't know if these fruits collected from the ground. We just don't know how much ethanol is there. There's got to be some, but we just don't know if there's more ethanol in these terrestrial fruit, in these ground source fruits than in the trees. We just don't know, and we don't know how often chimpanzees are consuming ethanol. So we can say they're scrumping, but it's hard to measure how much ethanol they're actually consuming. So more systematic work needs to be done in that area. We would like to understand how much scrumping varies across populations. So we're organizing a big symposium at Dartmouth, and we're going to bring in primatologists from around the world, and we're going to try to nail this question of how common is scrumping across African apes. So I think those are the two next steps to follow. So there's a handful of monkeys that are very interesting. There's some monkeys that are highly terrestrial, eating what we think are fermented palm fruits, but their ADH4 gene hasn't been studied. So we don't know if they have that same adaptation that apes have. So there could be some interesting parallel cases where other types of primates are evolving the same mutation. We just don't know.
This is a seriously interesting line of investigation. Nate, that is a great story. I guess I'm just reiterating that. It makes a lot of sense. It really does make a lot of sense. So I guess I can wish you good luck. Good luck to your dog too, and to the team as you move forward. And thank you for joining us. I hope to have you back for a real serious update on what comes next in this research, because this is fascinating. It's just captures the imagination.
Thanks, Dave. I would love that. Can't wait.
All right. Well, I'm trying to stick around. No, there I am. Oh my God, I'm gone again. Oh, now I'm over here. This is great. Okay, so despite that minor problem, that was as promised, really great story and a very compelling one. And there's some evidence to back it up. But as Nate said, there are gaps to fill in, and research to fill them will hopefully be forthcoming and very soon. When we know, if we know more, we're going to bring it to you. Remember, we are here every weekday with exciting science news, plus great things to look at in the night sky every night. So give us a like, hit the subscribe button. Do not miss out. Tomorrow, Deborah Bird will be here, 1715 Universal Time Coordinate, to show off the best of your pictures of the Perseids meteor shower, which peaks tonight, tomorrow, and the next day, and of the absolutely beautiful close pairing of Venus and Jupiter, which is going on right now in the pre-dawn sky. Get out there and take a look. I'm Dave Adalian, and I will see you next time. One Earth, one sky, EarthSky.